Hello, and in this video we're going to create the high poly, finish the low poly, bake some maps and normal maps, and lastly in Unity we'll be creating a custom shader to use some of the maps we have baked, and we could for example easily change the colors of the crates, and we also have a few more controls, and there is also a gradient effect going on. So let's get started. Back in Houdini we're going to start out with the high poly. Then to create a high poly from this I'm going to use a voxel, and this will create some more geometry on the mesh. Also gonna set my smoothing here. So you can see by default the voxel will make the edges a bit more smoother. So right now we are on a mid resolution, which is not that high and works pretty fast. I would go for custom resolution, and I will be starting with 003. This is to start with, and we can always later adjust it. Then we have more interesting settings to play around with, like adaptivity. If we increase this a little bit, you can see that the polygons will be used where there are a lot of detail. But for now I'm gonna keep it on 0. Then I'm interested in the project to original and smoothen. So you can smoothen the edges more than enough if you would like to. What I also notice here is that everything is one big piece now, because for later on if I want to bake the pieces it wouldn't bake that properly. So I'm gonna use a split node, and in the split node I'm gonna use the ID pieces I have created. Now I can split based on these pieces, so you can have separate voxels so they don't interact with each other. You can also see that my lock is losing a lot of detail. What I also want to do is I want to have an attribute that says which model should be metal or not. So in Unity, so we have a masks that controls this material. So the material knows then that the locks are metal, this top panel is metal, this side panel here is also metal, so that also is automatically done then. So I'm going to create a few attributes, and I will be first going to my lock, create attribute, and I will be calling it metal, and I will store it in the primitives, and it is an integer, and the value is 1. And I'm just simply gonna copy paste this to where I need it. So for example here the side booleans, I also want them to be metal, so I can simply put that here, and there will also be metal. Then here on the top part, this piece also needs to be metal, and also this handle support should also be metal. Then once you set up these nodes, you can go back here, and I'm going to use another split node. And in the split node, instead of saying ID pieces, I'm now going to type in metal, and everything that is now metal should be seen now. And now I can do some voxels here, so I can see that for these finer details I might have to increase my voxels. So then here for my lock and these smaller details I adjust the resolution, so I made the resolution a bit lower, and I also put some smoothing and sharpen the features. Then for my other box I don't have to go as low as my lock because this is a quite more bigger shape, and I think this is already looking pretty good. Maybe a little bit less smoothing. This looks okay to me. Then I will be copying the same system over here, and we'll be plugging in the other part of the crate. So in here I have my top piece, which looks okay to me. So if you want more smoothing again, just increase the smooth values. Then I'm going to look at the metal details. I might change this here to some bigger resolution, because I don't need to go super low in detail here. So once this is set up, we could merge these together, and this is then the high poly that we could use to bake. So before I'm going to start baking my maps, I also want to make a procedural mask for the shader. So this is then a mask I will be generating from the high poly, and We can also see that this is being packed, so we have 3 different masks that has been packed in the RGB channels. So if I go to the channels, this is my red information, which is the damage around the edges. My green information is more like a dirt and AO layer. And then I also have a gradient effect that you could use on the crate. Then in Houdini I will be creating these masks on top of this. What I first want to do is I want to color the crates. So all the metal pieces, I'm gonna give them a white color. Then all the normal pieces, they will be black. Then doing the same for the other parts. The metal piece is white and the normal crate is black. Then I merge them here. So the result should look like this, where we can clearly see what is a metal and what isn't metal. One more thing I want to add here is I want to restore the attribute of ID pieces. So I'm going to copy the ID piece node. Because of the voxeling, it removed all of the attributes and so on. But I can simply restore these values here. And I will be later needing them to separate the meshes again. The next thing that we want is the curvature. So you can type in curvature, and in the game dev we have a curvature. So plug in the result. This will take a moment. And we can see now the curvature of the crate. What I'm first going to start with is I only want the green edges, and these green edges will be representing for our damage on the crate and will be shown metal. So I'm going to disable the concave, which is the red value. So if I just lower all these values, you can see that the red value is now gone. Then I'm also going to use the single color, so I could easily use this. You can also do some color adjustment afterwards, and this is used by color adjustments. And in here we could, for example, invert the selection or boost certain values. Then I would like to have some random noise to mix with the perfect straight edges here, so we get some random damage. This could be done by an attribute noise, and by default it will look something like this. What we could do here is we can play around with the type of noise, and there are a few types that can be used. And I'm going to use the periodic Berlin, and I'm going to scroll down in the menu, and I will be changing the size to 0.05, so we have this type of noise going on. What also can be interesting is if you go to roughness and we lower this value, we can get rid of the random and cloudy shapes, and it will feel more like the Berlin. Then I'm going to use the color adjustment node here as well, and I'm going to work in grayscale values, so I will be turning down the saturation, and we could increase, for example, some of the contrast and the hammer, so you can have, like, on very specific places some damage. Then we want to combine these values together, and we can do this by a color blend node. And I'm going to use the noise we have here in the first input. My second input, I'm going to use my base mesh with the metal colors, and the last input is the mask, and this will be the curvature. Right now we don't really see a result, but if we invert the curvature, we now have some procedural damage along these edges. Also, we're gonna clamp the color values so they go from 0 to 1, so they don't get any bigger. And then if you want to make the mask a bit more intense, we can change up here some values, and we can see it's getting a little bit more intense there. So let's say 3. And now everywhere where we have this white line, there will be some damage on the crate. Then this edge damage is quite consistent along the whole crate. And I can use another attribute noise to create some more variation in there. And this one, I'm gonna set it to Worldly F1, which will create this type of noise. And I'm gonna keep the size here as 1 for the moment. Then again, I want to use the color adjustment, and I'm gonna set saturation low. I'm also gonna clamp the values to 0 to 1, And then I will be creating a mask here, and everywhere where we have the white information there will be some edge damage. So if I blend this together now, and I will be using one of the blending modes, and I'm going to use darken. We can see where we have this white, where we had the white values, we can now see some of the edge damage going on. Then you can play around with some of the settings and the noises to get the look you want. Then after that I will be doing another color adjustment, and in here we can then fine tune the values a little bit more. So first I'm gonna clamp it, and then I'm gonna look if I need to boost certain values, so you can get a little bit more control in that if you want to. And then this is my first mask for in the red channel. Then I'll create my second mask, which is then the AO, or like third layer. There is actually an occlusion node in here, so if I would quickly place it down here, this is then the result of the occlusion node. So you could use this also then to generate masks. This node might need some time to calculate. So another option, if you want to have a similar information, we could use also the curvature here again, and then we can use the concave features. So in here I'm going to use the red value, and I'm going to put a blur amount that's pretty high, so we have these details. So if I would compare the occlusion versus the concave, they are somewhat similar, but this one is a bit more intense, depending on, of course, the value I put in here. This is then my other mask. So if you also want some random noises in here, you could always use the attribute noise and multiply some noise in there. This is then my mask for the green channel. Then for the last channel I make a gradient, and in here we have a gradient node that can do this for us. So you can see that it automatically creates this gradient, and we can boost this value a little bit if you want to. This is something that's not necessary, it's more as an example that you could also do this. We can take these masks even further if you want to. So I recently saw this tutorial where someone created a wetness map by doing a simulation. So this could be also a pretty cool idea to, for example, integrate into the crate system, but this is then a bit more advanced. So now we have the three masks that I want. Then I want to merge them in one mesh where all the information is stored. For that I'm going to use a VOP. Don't worry, we're not going to do complicated things, we're just going to merge the colors together. So I'm going to plug in all the masks in the inputs, and I'm going to go into the network. So by default it should look like this. So in here we have our color value that I want to adjust, but this is only the color from my first input, so only the color from these edge damage that I have. But I also want to access the color from my second input and the third input. And to do this I'm gonna import a point attribute. So I'm gonna import some point attributes. And first of all we need a vector 3 because it's a color. Then we want it from the second input from this node, and the attribute is of course the color. Then I do this one more time, and in here I fill in the third input. Each of these colors are now a vector, so we have to go from vector to float so we can combine and adjust the colors. So now we can access the RGB channel from the colors. Then I want to go from float to vector to combine the colors. So my first channel, the red channel, will be the edge damage, which is the first input. Then in my green channel I want this dirt layer, and then the last channel the gradient. Then plug this into the color and go back up and review the VOP. You can see we have now successfully combined these colors together in one mesh. Once this is set up, we can now start thinking about the baking. What I want to do for a clean baking is I also want to split the top part from the bottom part so they don't intersect when baking normals. So I'm going to use the split node here, and I will be using that at the ID piece that I created. So at ID piece, then we have now this part. Then I'm going to use a transform to move up the other part. And let's say I'm going to move this up 4 units. Then merge these together, and this is now ready for baking. So I put it pretty high here, but that shouldn't influence anything when baking. This part we also need to do for the low poly then. So I'm gonna bring some of this down, and I'm gonna copy and bring in the low poly information. And if everything is right, they should have a nice overlapping. Then I can just simply place down the maps baker and fill in my low poly and the high poly. Then this maps baker, I want to exit this in Unity, so I'm gonna open my parameter menu again, and I will be creating a new folder which is called baker. So let's say first which maps I want. So I want the normal map, of course, and I want to have the vertex map, which is the mosques, and I will be changing the name to mosques. Then we can simply drag and drop these values. So I want to choose to bake it, to save the location, I want to control the resolution. I'm also going to expose the tracing mode and the max distance, and I'm going to hit apply on that. So that's in place then. Also something important, we need to unwrap the low poly, of course, and I'm going to use the auto UV here from the game devs. And we're going to switch to the UV view quickly. And I'm going to make some changes, and I like to use the UV unwrap. Then we can play around with some more settings if you want, like merge small islands. So if you would have a lot of small UV pieces, you can merge them. Something that I also like is axis align. So the pieces are now aligned along the X or Y axis. And we can also set which resolution that we will finally have. After this unwrap, I'm going to use the game dev normals, and with this normal node we can harden all UV seams. These settings of the soften normals I also expose in the baker, just in case if we would have some artifacts we also have some control in the normals. What could also be nice to have actually is flipping the normals. If you would use Unity or Unreal, you might have to flip the normal map. So we can go in the advanced settings, and here we can then flip the x-axis or the y-axis. So I'm gonna both include them here, so we also can change this if we need to. Then I will be going back in Unity to test out the baker. I've also added one small thing. I had the option to add UVs or not. This is one simple reason for it. If I would add UVs, it's going to slow down the tool a little bit. You can see it will take a little bit more time to calculate. But if I don't show the UVs, it works pretty fast now like it did before. So that's something interesting that you could also add. So it's just a simple switch here to show the UVs or not. So when building a crate, it's sometimes better to don't show them. And then I will build on top of my crate and add some cool details. So once I've added some details, I can now go in the bake menu. So we're going to first of all fill in the correct pot to save my image. Once fill in the correct location here, we can just simply click bake. And this might take a moment because it has to create a high poly and all the masks and then bake it. So once done baking, it might not immediately pop up, but after a while it should appear, or you should at least see it in the Explorer of Windows. Then I have my mask and my normal map, and of course we have to set it to normal and apply. And then just for now to test it, let's create a standard material. I'm just going to call it test. I will be deleting this later on anyway. And I'm going to fill in my normal map, and I will be dragging this material on my crate and making the color a bit darker. So you can see it did a pretty good job at this bottom part, which is pretty nicely baked. But for the top part, it didn't bake that well. So one mistake I made is if I go to part 2, I referenced the null node called outCrate, and outCrate is actually before the UVs, which means that part 2 doesn't actually has UVs. So I'm going to move this null node and I'm going to place it down here, and this will then fix the problem. And then this should be fixing the problem. So if I would drag my material on it now, you can already see that it looks way better than it did before. So I gave the crate a nice color, and the nice thing about this is that what if we make the box bigger? Let's say my box is a little bit bigger. You can see that of course the UVs are being recalculated, so they are broken. And then when I click bake again, it should be updating pretty fast now. So then I just re-import the normal map, and we can see that the changes are being made. So this is pretty cool to work with, so we can make fast changes on the fly in Unity itself. So if someone needs a bigger crate, we can just simply increase sizes and bake again, and we have the result immediately. And we can also see here, because I separated the two parts individually, we can see that we don't have like overlapping normals on these sides. Then the next step would be creating a shader that uses the mask, so we can use these edge damage on the crate. So we'll be right clicking, and I will be using the Unity shader graph, and I will be going for the PPR graph, and I will be calling it crate shader. Then open this. When you open the shader graph, it would look like this, and in here we can drag in the textures. So if I go back here, and I need my mask and my normal map. So I'm just firstly gonna assign my normal to the normal slot. So that's all done. And it would also be nice if I can access the type of texture. So I'm gonna go here, and I'm gonna use the texture 2D, and this will create a value that I can throw outside of this network. So I'm gonna call this mask, and in here I'm gonna fill in that mask that I just made. Then I'm also need one for my normal map, so normal texture. I'm gonna fill in the normal, and then I also have another texture that I actually use for my roughness to get some interesting variations. So I'm gonna use it roughness texture, and this is a tiling texture that I have, so I can use it also later on. Then we can just drag this in here and switch this. Do the same for the normal, and then we can start building up the shader. So in here from the mask, the red channel is for the edge damage, which will be metal or not metal, and I will be lerping between that. So this is then my lerp value. This can also directly be used in the metalness, and then we need to have some colors. So I'm gonna type in color. This would then be the main color of the crate. For example, I can just take some red color here so that it's clear to see, and I need to duplicate this, and this is then my metal color. This will be this grayish, and then I will put this in the color. So now we have set up the first mask. That's sort of the base idea of how we're going to use this channel, by using some lerps and then changing between these values. What could also be nice here, if we could control this amount also a little bit. So I'm gonna multiply with this value, and I will be creating a parameter that I can control outside of the shader. And let's make a little bit more room for this network. Then I want to clamp the value just to make sure it's staying in this 0 to 1 range, and I will be replacing this. And this setup, I'm gonna copy it for the other channels as well, so I can control each channel how intense they are. Something important here for this edge damage and metalness is I don't want to work with a lot of grayscale values, because mainly you will have either it's a metal or it's a non-metal. So I'm gonna use a floor function, and this will make sure I don't have a lot of grayscale values. Then further keep using the lerps. So my second channel was sort of this dirt layer, so I'm gonna use a lerp again, and I'm gonna use a multiply, and this multiply is gonna darken the base color. And I'm also going to use a color node for this, so I can make it, for example, a little bit green or brownish, and then merge it here. And then here we have the last channel, which is the gradient, and again lerping this value in there. I'm going to create a color node to choose what the color should be, and we can put this in the output of the color. Then I want to build on the roughness, so I will be needing a sample texture, and I already made this texture here. This texture I'm gonna multiply the value with it, so I can later say how intense this should be. And then I'm also gonna clamp this value, so we can get more control in how much variation, because it's a quite noisy texture. Then I also lerp with the values. So first of all, I have the difference of the metal that I want to use. So you can see that my paint material is this color, and my metal I'm gonna use 0.3 at the moment. And I'm also going to lerp with the dirt mask, and it should look something like this. You can see it a little bit in the picture, where we have this some whiter values in concave edges. Then I actually have to do a -1, because we are working with smoothness here, which is the reverse of roughness. So I'm gonna plug in smoothness in here. So this is then the base setup for the shader, and I'm gonna expose values so we can control them outside of the shader. So for the color, I'm just gonna right click, convert to property, and I'm gonna double click and call it color of my paint. Same for the metal color of metal. Then this will be the dirt color, and then here I have the gradient color. Then I will be creating some floats for the mask controls. So I'm gonna go to vector 1, and this is then a mask red channel control, and I'm gonna do this then for all the channels. So green, and then for the blue one as well. Then I need a roughness slider. Then I have the roughness for the minimum and maximum value for in the clamp. And then lastly, the metal roughness. Once these values are created, we are now gonna include them here, so we can use it and save the shader. And now we're gonna test out the shader. So create a material. So create demo. I will be typing in here the name of the shader. So create shader, and I'll be assigning this to my create of course. You can see that the result now is black grade, because all of these values are set to 0. And I can also see that I flipped some of my lerps, so I have to go back in the shader and quickly adjust this by reversing these changes. And while I'm here back again, I might as well add the default values in here. So the mask should be 1, then my roughness, I'm also gonna say 1, the minimum should be 0, and maximum also 1, and my metalness should be around 3.35, and click save. So if I would now reset the shader, it should look like this, and still the roughness is a bit off, but I can easily play around with these values. So then I'm just gonna tweak the values and make sure everything fits a bit nicer. And so we can really see the mask doing their job. So for example, the first mask was with the edge damage. So if I increase this a lot, we can see that there is more and more of these edge damage going on. Then the second mask was the dirt, so you can also see that going on in here, and especially if you darken the color, but this is of course way too much. And then the last one was the gradient, which you can see here. So the cool thing about this is that we can just copy the shader and change the color to what you want, so you can create more variations in what you're looking for. That was it for this part of the tutorial, and next part we're gonna create a decal system that places around decals on the crate.